having local leaders as the only ones who informed land use. And so now we have commonly the master plan or the comprehensive plan. And so what that document is, for anyone here who's not familiar, is it's really a guiding document that backs up the zoning ordinance. So when we're talking about the Great Lakes coastline and any potential changes that we want to make on the coast, in terms of zoning, and maybe that's density, maybe that's, as we talked about in previous meetings, preventing revetments, anything along those lines, we want to make sure that that's backed up in the master plan. So this project that we kicked off in 2020 was funded in part by the Coastal Zone Management Program in Eagle and was conducted by the Land Information Access Association, a nonprofit out of Traverse City. And the goal of this project was to work with South Haven community, South Haven Casco community, with the township, the two townships, as well as the city, to sort of figure out what's going on in the community. What are the issues that you're dealing with in terms of the Great Lakes variability and their height? And then also what are sort of the preliminary steps that we can be taking to make changes? And really this chapter that we're going to go through is that preliminary step. It's sort of a snapshot in time of what you're dealing with, what the Great Lakes are presenting as challenges to not only South Haven, but also communities across the state. And then, like I said before, essentially having this document in place so that when you do eventually want to make any zoning changes or any programmatic changes in your community to be able to make yourselves more resilient along the coastline, you have this document in place to be able to do so. So the goal of tonight is really just to run through this chapter and discuss what was talked about in the first two meetings and some of sort of those preliminary steps that you can take in what you talked about before, and just going through what this chapter presents and what it goes through. So kicking off, what we start with here in the chapter, we talk about the importance of the Great Lakes coastline. We have 3,300 miles of Great Lakes shoreline, which is really incredible when you think about it. And obviously it's a highly sought after resource. A lot of people want to live on a coastline. How can you blame them? It's beautiful, but that also presents a lot of problems economically, socially, and environmentally when the Great Lakes fluctuate as we know they do. So as we talked about before in this graph right here at the top, the Great Lakes tend to fluctuate every 10 to 20 years. It's typically a decadal pattern. And you can see here that from about 2000 to 2015, we had really low water. And what that meant was that there was a lot of that really sandy beach that Michigan's famous for. And a lot of people, typically people own homes for about 7 years. So they have a pretty short memory of what's going on, or they didn't see when they moved to the community. All they saw was this expansive beach and they thought, what a great place to build a home. But what they didn't know is that just 5 years prior and in decades past, that land was actually underwater. And so and I should also mention that and this was one of the issues that was mentioned in the previous meetings, is that the state has very little regulation over the use of land along the Great Lakes coastline. It's really up to the local jurisdictions to make decisions on how that land is to be used. And so what we've seen is a lot of communities across the state don't have any zoning in place when it comes to the Great Lakes shoreline, and buildings can go right up to the shoreline as long as there's no state regulation in place, such as a dune protection or something of that sort. So really, the issue that you all identified in those first couple of meetings, it was one of them was that South Haven, you do have some regulations in place, more than we've seen in other communities, but it's important to build off of that and really gear your decision making going forward based on the decisions that we talked about here. So long tangent, but what we're seeing in essence is changing water levels along the Great Lakes. Obviously, you all saw that over the past 5 years as they reached record highs. In good news, right here, you can see that there are projections for the lakes to go back down in the coming years. However, we don't know how long that's going to be for. And we'll keep going through here. I'm skipping ahead. Really what this is caused by, and these fluctuations and the issues that they cause, is the wave energy and the height of the waves that are coming in, and then eventually the erosion that they're causing. So you'll see erosion along bluff lines, You see homeowners losing property to the Great Lakes. So if you're a Great Lakes shoreline property owner, the size of your property fluctuates with the lake. So obviously, if you're a shoreline owner and you see the water coming right up to your house, as some people probably have in the last 5 years, that's obviously of great concern. And it brings up the key issue that we've really facilitated discussions around, which is, what do you save? Do you save the beach house or do you save the beach? Because as we just discussed previously, if you put a revetment in, if you put a seawall in, you, for the time being, can save the house, but that messes with the natural dynamics of the beach and the way that sand moves on and offshore. And potentially what happens when you have an entire community of nothing but revetments is you lose the beach altogether, and that can have big implications for the natural environment. So you're going to lose natural ecosystems. It can have a negative impact on your tourism base. You know, people are drawn to the community because they can visit those beaches, and they spend money and stay in the community at the hotels and the gas stations because of the beaches. So if you lose that, it's a big loss economically, and then socially as well. You know, a lot of coastal communities, and South Haven's no exception, you pride yourselves on the fact that you're on the coastline and you've got a beautiful beach coastline. And so that question consistently comes up of, what should we save, the beach or the beach house? And really the discussion that we've presented to people is that that's the decision that you have to make. And that's a difficult one, because you have the interests of the general public, and then you have the interests of people who live along the beach. So going through further, I'll get further into that in the discussion, that the answers that you all gave to that question, is that we are seeing changes in global climate, as well as climate along the Great Lakes and the implications for those. We're expected to see in Michigan a climate that's more familiar to people who live in Tennessee by the mid-century. And also what that infers is that we're going to have greater precipitation and storminess. So rather than having a 100-year storm, once every 100 years, there's 1% chance that that's going to happen. We're seeing a lot of communities having 500-year storms frequently, and communities that are having 100-year storms much more frequently than every 100 years. So that's another point that we like to bring home, is that a 100-year storm doesn't mean that you're going to have that level of storm every 100 years. It means that each year you have a 1% chance of that kind of storm occurring. And unfortunately, we're seeing that number likely needs to be changed. That the 100-year storm is now so frequent that it could be considered a 50-year or a 20-year storm. We're also seeing increases in water temperature, which will also have implications for how frequently the Great Lakes rise and fall. So the point of that was really to have, like I said, when you're backing up your zoning ordinance changes with protecting the Great Lakes, it's important to have the science behind it to explain to someone, if you have a grievance where someone's saying, I don't think that you should be able to regulate property in this way. Well, here's the science. Unfortunately, the increased storminess and the fluctuation in the Great Lakes, and that increasing, and what we just saw in the last 5 years in the community, it does warrant that, and that hasn't been decided upon yet, but that some regulation may be needed to prevent loss of property or life. So going forward, beyond just the water issues, we also want to look at vulnerability in the community in other ways. So when we go through that, we talked about the climate variability. The other aspects that's going to affect is public health. So we see greater instances of ticks across the western side of the state. The increased temperatures have shown issues for people with asthma. So this isn't just a coastal property owner issue. There are other aspects of sustainability along the coastline that we need to consider. So when we're talking about vulnerability, what we're talking about is exposure plus sensitivity. So how exposed are you to a certain threat? And then in terms of demographics, how sensitive are you to that exposure? So in terms of heat sensitivity, we know that people who are above the age of 65, people who are in poverty, who are living alone, they may have a more difficult time accessing the resources needed to overcome that vulnerability. And so what we wanted to do with this project also is to map out those vulnerable populations so that you can decide more effectively how to essentially site, maybe a cooling facility in the instance of an extreme heat event, and to understand who's most vulnerable in the community. Um, and then also with heat, to understand, we talk about the urban heat island effect from there not being enough trees. So tree canopy is important. Um, so we looked at that, we looked at heat vulnerability, we looked at the heat assessment, and all of those maps are at the end of let me make sure I know what page I'm on. All of those maps are at the end here. So we show you um, how exposed by census tract people are. I believe this is block group actually. How exposed people are, and then the populations who are exposed. And so you can take a look at each of those variables and decide how to allocate resources accordingly. So moving forward, that's all along the same line. Talk about management of those. And then, so after heat, we also get into heavy rain and flooding and the exposure to different flooding scenarios. And let me make sure I've got that right. Yep. And I'll talk about that in a second. But what we really talked about in the first two meetings is, like I said, the issue with shoreline hardening. Like I said, it does save the house temporarily, but remember that Mother Nature is pretty much undefeated. And if you have a house with a seawall in front of it, that doesn't guarantee that the house is safe. Wave energy is very powerful. It has the ability to wipe away seawalls. And if that happens, what you have, and we have plenty of pictures that we can share with you across the state, or you can search it, are seawalls that are basically just drifting out in the water, and the beach is destroyed. And so we call it not to pick on New Jersey, but the New Jersification of Michigan, where you don't have a beach, you have a lot of riprap broken up in the water, and it's very unappealing, and it makes it, the resource is ultimately destroyed. So while revetments may be, you may want to use revetments in certain areas if you determine that part of the community is, we need to save these homes or infrastructure or whatever it may be. But it's also important to remember that the negative consequences of doing so are loss of the beach, and remembering that the revetment doesn't guarantee that those structures are saved. And what we also want to mention with revetments is that if one property owner puts one in, so you can see here, this is a chain of revetments that have gone in, it affects the property owner next to that property owner who's put the revetment in. So if one person, puts in a seawall, it can cause an expedited level of erosion on the property next to it. So that's another thing to consider when you're choosing whether or not revetments should be allowed in the community. And we'll discuss later on ultimately what this group talked about in terms of revetments going forward. So here we have, right here, like I said, we're not, as a part of this project, prescribing any solutions. Really, we want to present the pros and cons of each. And so right here we have armoring, the choice to put up seawalls, the choice to nourish, so beach replenishment, and then the option to relocate or planned relocation of houses and infrastructure, whether that's in a 10-year or a 50-year vision for the community. And like I said before, each of those has a set of pros and cons that will have to be weighed. That wasn't, these decisions weren't going to be possible in such a short planning process. These are going to be, as I'll talk about, a lot of education to the public, and a lot more community discussions around what the best choices are going to be. So finally, like I talked about, we not only looked at heat vulnerability assessments, but also the vulnerability of different parts of the community to flooding in different scenarios. So we broke those scenarios down into a lucky future, an expected future, and a perfect storm future. The lucky future is when lake levels are low and we're looking at storms that are fairly average. So, um, types of storms that you've seen before, and the lake levels are low. In the expected future, lake levels are at their typical level, their long-term average, and you're seeing a 20 or 50. The 100-year storm is more like a 20 or 50-year storm. And then in the perfect storm future, that is the worst case scenario. That's when we're seeing lake levels at their highest, and you're getting a 500-year storm. And so I'll just quickly show you the map of that, of those results. And it's a little difficult to see on here. Let me see if I can zoom in a bit. All right. So here you can see in the yellow, we have the lucky future. In the orange, we have the expected, and in the red, we have the perfect storm. And actually, you can see from this map that South Haven, along the actual coastline, doesn't have much of a risk in the expected or the perfect storm future. It's really in the inland where you start to see more of a risk. And then we also overlaid that with the building footprint, so you can potentially see how many buildings would be impacted in each of the climate scenarios. And you can see once you get up to that perfect storm event, which I said before might become a little more frequent or a little more of the expected going forward, that there are areas that are potentially at risk and may require some more planning and zoning around. And then here we just collected some statistics on each of those different scenarios for each of the jurisdictions. So we showed how many acres would be impacted in each of the climate scenarios. We also showed how many parcels would be affected by each of those scenarios. And that's really just to give you an idea of the expanse of this issue. And also, like I said before, if you're making any zoning changes going forward, this is something that you can point to that, in an expected future, we have 2,000 acres of land that could potentially be affected and over 2,000 parcels that may be affected. And also we wanted to look at the economic impact of that as well. So we broke it down by residential versus non-residential. And you can see that most of the land that's going to be affected in each of these scenarios, about 3/4 across the board in each of the communities, is residential. So again, we're talking about primarily homeowners here, which of course brings up the issue of, again, do we save the beach or the beach house? Obviously, we're all very protective of our property, but we also have to keep in mind the public good in terms of the beach and the natural shoreline. And then we also looked at the total SEV in each of the communities and each of the expected futures, so that you can get some idea of how, if nothing is done, how much of the tax base may be affected and how much property value may be affected. And then again, down here, we took a look at if you were to regulate based on setbacks, how many more parcels would be affected. So here, for example, we had 1173 expected in the city of South Haven. That's how many parcels would be affected in the expected future by flooding. If you were to implement a 50-foot setback, now you're looking at a regulation of 1,482 parcels. So all of this is basically to give you some metrics to be able to weigh, how much do you want to regulate, if at all, and how protected those parcels would be in theory from those regulations. So now let's go into what we talked about in those first couple of meetings and what this group, some of the issues that were raised and potentially some of the solutions that were discussed. So we kicked this off on October 27th. And at that first meeting, we answered a few questions in some breakout rooms. So we talked about what are the current challenges that the community is facing because of the Great Lakes. Is the community doing everything it might to promote resiliency through its planning and zoning, and if not, why? excuse me, what changes could help the community to promote coastal resilience? Um, and then going back to that beach versus beach house question, asking that to the group. And then who leads these decisions? Are these local decisions? Would it be more prudent for the county to lead the charge on this? Or should a representative from the state of Michigan be taking charge? Um, what we heard in terms of the issues were basically once, we took all those sticky notes and divided them up, we had 5 categories that we really saw as the issues here. So we had governance, we had infrastructure, data and information, economy, and environment and safety. So what we heard from government, and this is what I discussed at the beginning of this presentation, is that there are very few local coastal regulations in the community other than those set by Eagle. So really the only thing, uh, as discussed, that's governing the shoreline in this community are those established by Eagle. Um, in addition, some property owners are hardening their shoreline while others are not. That creates an issue of, like I talked about before, that some property owners are going to have, if you're worried about your shoreline eroding, you're extra worried about it eroding if your neighbor just put in a seawall. It encourages you to put in a seawall because now your shoreline is going to erode quicker because your neighbor has put in revetments. Um, Obviously, because a lot of this is home ownership, like I said, about 3/4 of the parcels that would be affected in these scenarios are residential properties. Obviously, that creates a lot of emotion and contention around the issue. Um, there's difficulty in relocating. So as that third option, as we talked about, the options are to do nothing, harden the shoreline, replenish the shoreline, or move. Some of those options are going to be more difficult, and it sounds like from the community that a lot of homes, it would be difficult to move them. Um, a lot of the rest of them dealt with, what can we do? Local officials are already doing so much. They already have too much on their plate. This is a difficult issue to make a part of your day to day. And also the fact that, like I talked about, the shorelines fluctuate every 10 to 20 years. It's very difficult to work on projects that are taking a 10 to 20 year view of the issue when you have something that's pressing today. The other issue is that the water is going to go to back down again. Uh, and that's going to encourage people to want to build on the sandy beach again. So we can't just plan during high water. We also have to consider that during low water, we need to keep pushing this message out that we need to be sustainable in how we site infrastructure and homes. Need more coordination between municipalities. So this is a great example of the coordination already, that these 3 jurisdictions are working together, but potentially you need to work with the other shoreline jurisdictions in the county, as well as representatives from the state of Michigan, to know what kind of decisions can be made and what kind of funding there is to implement those decisions. Um, Moving on, we also talked about infrastructure. So the water supply, the wastewater, power lines, marinas, roads, all of those are being affected by flood threats and by especially erosion. Um, and the critical infrastructure ultimately is it's cross jurisdictional. So almost at its core, this type of project planning requires cross jurisdictional coordination. Data and information, that's an issue that we see across the state. These are pretty complex issues when you consider that we're looking at shoreline erosion, the wave energy, how to measure the ordinary high water mark. What is the economic impact going to be, not only of the natural processes of the shoreline, but also the decisions that you make to address those issues. Um, so I need to, centralize that data and information. Also, the need for the community to be more educated on these issues. So it's all well and good if we're well versed on these issues, but if the public isn't involved in the decision-making process and they don't know essentially what we're dealing with in terms of the Great Lakes fluctuations, it's going to be very hard to get things done. You need to have the buy-in from the public on any decision that's made. And that's the next one here. That can be done through, as the group discussed, through various mediums, and the idea of bringing in subject matter experts. we'll talk about the rest of these when we talk about the solutions that were developed by the focus group. In terms of the economy, same thing that we talked about before, the tourism impact, the home values that could be affected, damages to local investments. The example that was provided was the recently renovated lighthouse, the cost to renourish beaches, especially when one storm can wipe them away. These really aren't long-term solutions. And then who bears the cost of cleanup? How do we pay for this? So when a house falls in the water, who pays for it? Those are all real issues that came up in that issue in that meeting, and that are valid questions to ask. And then in terms of environment and safety, you cited that there have been an increase in calls for rescue. Obviously, the bluffs are being impacted by erosion, access to the beach, the wave energy. All of these are issues so when we break them all down, these were the 5 categories that we come up with. And so in meeting 2, we thought, how do we solve some of these? What's sort of a narrative that we can put in place to get started on addressing these issues? So in that second meeting, we had 2 breakout rooms. The first one asked, looking at the South Haven Casco shoreline in 15 years, what changes have been made? And what could the community do in 2021 to begin working towards these changes? And then we asked, how could the community get more coastal information? Because as we talked about, the buy-in from the public is really the most critical feat at this point that you need to deal with, is getting a lot more people on board. And then who could take the lead in organizing and communicating coastal data from different resources? So you're getting data from, the city of South Haven has its own data. Casco is going to have its own. The state's going to provide data. Michigan Tech has its own data. Who's going to centralize all of that? And so we took all of those discussion notes and created a narrative for what this group can work on going forward. I'm not going to go through the entire thing right now because feel free to read that on your own. But to summarize, what this group basically came down to was that in a best case scenario future, that your shoreline hasn't become New Jersey, that you've largely not allowed revetments to destroy the natural beach. It's in accordance with best practices to make sure that the coastline, to the extent possible, understanding that we do have to work in the built environment somewhere. We need places to live, we need residences, but to the extent possible, that the natural shoreline is able to continue on those natural processes, and that the beach is maintained, and that bluffs are not destroyed through faulty development. And so really what needs to happen to get started in this is what we talked about was the creation of a cross-jurisdictional committee solely dedicated to coastal issues. And what that coastal planning committee would work on right off the bat would be to decide the makeup and the frequency. So are these local officials? Are these residents? How are you deciding who's making this up? How often are you meeting? How are you getting information out to residents and visitors? You need to engage the public directly to gather sentiments on these issues. So if you just get the perspective of people who live on the shoreline, obviously the sentiment is going to be, we need to harden the shoreline. If you only get the sentiments from the people who live inland, obviously they're going to favor the beach. There has to be more public engagement that this committee can lead to find solutions that sort of find that middle ground. The other aspect would be identifying funding mechanisms for project development, especially from the state. So the state of Michigan's coastal management program, a big part of this project, and the reason that the coastal zone management program is funding the work that we've done for this master plan chapter, is their hope is that through this work, and now that you've identified a direction to go, is to identify concrete projects that you want to work towards. And like I said, that has to come after a lot more public engagement and public meetings. But once you have those projects in mind, there is funding available from the state to implement some of those through the Michigan's the coastal management program. And then making sure that you're meeting on a regular basis, not only during times of high water like we had just experienced, but making sure that once the water goes back down, that education and those meetings continue, so that this isn't an issue that goes out of people's minds until the next time that the waters come back up. So to conclude, we have the vulnerability maps here that you can use in some of your decision making, the heat sensitivity, we have pervious pavement and tree canopy. So you can see the areas of your community that may be most susceptible to flooding because there's a lot of parking lots or buildings that make the area impervious. The tree canopy really highlights not only issues of heating, but also trees capture rainwater, or at least prevent the extreme erosion that you would see if there were no trees there. Those exposure maps and vulnerability maps that we discussed, a digital elevation model to show you sort of the data that we combined together. This was one aspect of the data, along with wave energy, that was combined to create these climate scenario maps. And then we did that for each of the 3 jurisdictions. So without further ado, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. And I think I'll open up the chat here. Oh, it looks like Matt was just posting. So do we have any questions? I know that was a lot of information to pack in pretty quick there, but. Yeah, Michael. I think you're on mute right now, Michael.
Do this for a living. There you go. I'm not sure what your intention is on how we move through the meeting. I mean, there were questions that came up as I read through the fine piece of work. It's great work. Thank you very much. But do you want questions, clarification on what's in the article here, or are we going to go back through it, or how do we proceed here in this meeting?
If you have any questions on what was just presented, I'm happy to answer. I know that was a lot, so a lot of people may want to review the document on their own, and
Absolutely.
then we're happy to answer any emails or phone calls about what's in here. But yeah, for this meeting, that was pretty much it. Just this, and then answering any questions you might have.
Let me ask one particular one that caught my eye, and I still haven't been able to see how it fits in the flow. Back on page 8, you included the Rockefeller Foundation's 12 criteria for resilient communities, which are great, but I didn't quite see how that fit into our discussion here.
Yeah, that was really just to provide a definition of sustainability and giving people an idea of what sustainability means. The other caveat that I'll provide with this chapter, and that we've seen with other communities who we've helped with sustainability planning, is that we typically provide much more information than you may want. And we encourage you to pick and choose the information out of the chapter to incorporate into your master plan, because some of it may just not be necessary for you. But we want to make sure that if you we provide more than you need, and if there's something that you don't see necessary in your chapter, feel free to cut it out.
Yeah, I guess it struck me reading through that that's another point in our decision-making process looking forward, is making a determination of how resilient we think our community is. How resilient our community is going to impact how big a step we take with our plan.
Right.
You can't move community that's not resilient very far.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks.
Any other questions while we? Yes, Joe. Sorry, I had to scroll down to make sure nobody was raising their hand.
Okay. We talk about these seawalls and people putting them up to protect their property. And then that forces their neighbor, in most cases south of them, to put one up to protect their property, which then puts the next neighbor in harm's way. So they put one up, and so on and so forth. I keep thinking about South Haven. The biggest seawall is where our 2 lighthouses are, and they stick way out, and they're solid structures. And if I'm not mistaken from these different presentations, what I've learned before is the North Beach does not seem to erode. And I think even Kate once said, we don't add any sand to the North Beach, it's just natural. because of the lighthouses is like a big seawall. So the sand stays there. Matter of fact, sometimes it gains sand. But the South Beach keeps losing sand because of that so-called giant seawall. So I know it's a loaded question, but would we be better off slicing off or cutting in half that seawall? I don't know if it's even possible, but could that be a major benefit for everything south of the Black River, where the giant seawall is and the lighthouses?
That's an interesting question. One of the caveats I always present in these presentations is that I am neither a lawyer or an engineer. So that would be one where I would say an engineering study would probably be the best course of action. But that is an interesting question. Yeah, I don't know.
But I'm not looking for an answer or an engineering question. The question I have is that giant seawall is the thing that's causing so much erosion on the south side of the city, or am I wrong on that? Because based on what you're saying, these seawalls, it seems like that's the reason all South Beach is shrinking, because of that seawall. Forget what we can do legally, forget what we can do from an engineering stamp, forget what the community even wants. Is that the cause of, I'm sorry, is that the problem with the whole south side?
It may be. I'm not, like I said, I'm not, I don't know, but it may be. I'm just not sure because I'm not familiar with it.
Dick, do you have a question?
Well, Zach, if I could jump in, can you hear me?
Yeah.
That's a really good question, Joe, for Guy Meadows, who's our colleague up at Michigan Tech, who's the coastal geomorphologist and engineer. Technically, that structure that sticks out into the lake, it's more like a coastal engineer would call it a groin rather than a seawall. A seawall runs perpendicular to the water's edge. A groin sticks out into the water. And if the predominant movement of the sand along South Haven is from north to south, which I believe it is, then you're right, that groin is effectively stopping sand from moving to the south and is probably causing the troubles to the south. Do you know, is that an Army Corps of Engineers structure? Who owns that structure?
It is
the
on
Army
the
Corps.
Army Corps does.
Yeah,
It's
so
the Army Corps.
that's your problem. You're going to have to deal with the Army Corps about, I mean, they've got a mission to maintain navigational, maritime navigation. And you're not the only place that has one of these structures sticking out into the lake that's causing those troubles. And there's been some long-standing debate about whether they should be there or whether they could be modified or what the real remedy is. So it's a thorny question. But in terms of the technical answer about it, how much damage might it be causing, or what are the possible technical solutions, Guy might be able to at least give you some thoughts on that. So I don't know if it's worth maybe reaching out to him. He may not be happy that I'm dropping his name like that, but he's the guy who's, pardon the pun, he's the one who knows how these things work.
Thanks, Dick.
Mark Odlin, do you have a question?
Yeah, it's a question for Zach and for Richard. Now, as I live in South Haven Township, and as I look at the shoreline in South Haven Township, which is immediately south of the city, and I look at the armoring that has taken place in the last 12 months, there's very little that is not armored right now. There have been thousands of feet armored just in the last 6 months. So given the fact that all that armoring has taken place, what recommendation do you have going forward? Because that's the reality we deal with. It's armored. What recommendation do you have going forward as to how we deal with all of this information you've given us?
I can take a crack at that. The lake dynamics are long-term, they're decadal. You know, when you look at those trends, you're looking at years and years. I think a lot of the shoreline management issues that coastal communities face are of the same decadal order, right? So it's really, really, really hard to respond to high water or low water or things in between in the moment. And being reactionary and being pushed back on your heels by these different conditions. Storms, same way, right? They can come up and surprise you and bite you. And one of the, I think one of the paradigm shifts for coastal communities in the state has to be taking a longer view, so that from a policy standpoint and a regulation standpoint and a property owner standpoint, you're smoothing out those extremes with those policies, with a change, frankly, in attitude of what it means to build and live and be on the shoreline. Understanding that the sand's literally shifting under your feet. You're not going to have the same conditions year after year after year, and that's atypical of a lot of property ownership and a lot of property management. If you're not on water, and a parcel's just sort of inland somewhere, you don't have these same dynamics to deal with. So one of the key challenges, I think, for all of us that live in shoreline communities is to start to take that longer view. And you know, that hardening that's there now is going to be challenged by the lake. It's been challenged by the lake since the first day it went in, and it's going to be challenged by the lake as the years go by. And it's not an easy or quick thing to make these decisions in very short order or in crisis situations. So I think acknowledging and understanding better those natural processes and the time that they take to ebb and flow really needs to be a part of the thinking. And that's why master planning and zoning play such, I think, important and really appropriate roles in helping communities start to think through and over time deal with and get better at dealing with those shoreline dynamics.
I appreciate that answer, because that's the long view. And you're right, we find ourselves many times dealing with the urgency of the moment, and we do things. I mean, I look at the shore, I live on the shore, I look at the shoreline, and we used to walk miles and miles and miles from where we live all the way into South Haven and all the way south to the nuclear power plant. And it wasn't unusual to walk and see airline tires and car bodies and car frames and concrete that had been ripped up from roadways. You name it, you'll find it. You'll find hundreds of tires chained together filled with concrete. So that urgency of the moment occurred in 1974, 1986, 1952. The property that we were on has been moved back twice. And so I guess the heart of this is I appreciate the long-term view, the long-term answer to this, but millions and millions of dollars have been spent armoring the shoreline in the last 12 months. It's almost like we're too late to the party.
So
Mike?
Yeah, I still want to agree with Mark. I mean, I think you captured it well, by the way, on page 17 of your report. To me, that was the whole issue. And, you know, my group has heard me say many times, I get frustrated. We're not a planning commission, we're a symptom commission. We don't solve, we don't plan, we don't anticipate and prevent problems. Almost every meeting is about putting a Band-Aid on something that has arisen just to keep to the status quo. So I think what I heard from Mark's point, I'd like to reinforce it. Says, so how do we use this information? Do we put a marker in the ground that says, hey, look, what we've done, but moving forward, what does this change in our land use, in our zoning? How does this change it looking forward? Because those revetments are there. I agree with Mark. I don't think there's an empty parcel from South Beach to city limits that hasn't got revetment in. And we got in a little trouble because we tried to say no to one. There was some houses that are a good 180 feet from the beach, and we said, no, we don't think you need a revetment right now. Well, sure enough, that didn't go very far. They got their revetment, but it's difficult because the information here seems to say, I'm going to be too frank. I keep reading this and it says revetments don't work. They don't work. They buy time, and in the time they buy it, they take away the community use of the beach. So it just sounds like a bad deal all the way around. And yet we continue to do it. So I don't know. Is this information to be future focused that says, boom, okay, let's learn our lesson? Maybe we talk about setbacks for building. Maybe we're really restrictive on building permits moving forward. I don't know.
Dick?
Yeah, to kind of riff on that you're not alone. There are communities up and down Lake Michigan, especially, that have substantially now armored their beach and are going to be struggling and asking exactly the same questions that you're asking. So for what it's worth, you're in good company that way. I think realistically, you do have some options. One, if you do have any beach left that has not been armored, you might think seriously about doing what Chickamauga Township did recently, which was adopt an ordinance banning the installation of armoring, but allow temporary geotubes to provide some temporary relief during really high water periods, with the hope that when the lakes go back down, you can open up those geotubes, dump the sand back out on the beach. If you're already beyond that, if you are fully armored, then really you have only a few options. One is to just say we're going to let people continue to maintain those arming structures and know that that's going to probably come ultimately to the loss of the beach. Now, if the lakes go back down tomorrow and they drop pretty precipitously, you could very well get some beach back for a time. But the real concern that the coastal geologists are telling us is, especially if you've armored everything, you've starved the sand supply that's necessary to keep replenishing the beach. And so if you allow folks to continue to maintain those structures, you've decided to basically at some point lose the beach. So that's one option. The other option is to say, maybe we need to start beach nourishment programs and try and find a sand source that we can bring in and replenish those beaches, at least when the lakes are high, to maintain some kind of a natural beach. Then you run the question of who's going to pay for that. So now you're going to have a long planning process to kind of figure out how to allocate, where you're going to find the sand source and how you're going to allocate the costs of doing that. So that's another option. Another option would be to say, we're not going to let people maintain that armoring, that once it starts to fail, you basically prohibit it and then turn it into a non-conforming use, and then come up with a mechanism to say, okay, you've got it for now, but when it starts to fail, that's when you need to take it out and restore the beach back to a natural beach. Now that has some legal implications, and my research team is currently studying, once you declare something to be non-conforming use under the current zoning law, you have the right to maintain it, continue to maintain it in some way. So there's some legal issues there that we're trying to sort out now, but trying to figure out in the long term where the shoreline has been armored, under what conditions does it become timely to say now is the time to take it back out and restore the beach to its national. So really, I think honestly, those are your three options, that you're confronting at this point, given the armoring structure. And they do require some long-term thought, because you need to start planning now for what are the conditions you're going to put in place to get to where you want to be eventually. And that's either continue to armor or figure out a way to get the structures out when the time comes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I probably wasn't as clear as I needed to be there. I guess it leads to, for me, the basic question, I think Mark was asking the same thing, is, okay, this is great information, but how do we use it to our advantage? What is the purpose of providing this? How do you see us using this moving forward? I understand it's part of our decision-making process. And you did capture the dynamic well. I mean, we kind of react to what we perceive as our condition. The water's down in March now, and you can walk down there and see that the water's down. But not everybody in the city is going to read that paragraph about wave energy, wave height. They're not going to read about the other forces that are much more destructive to our bluff than the height of the water. So, what appears to be, oh, look, nothing to worry about anymore. We got a lot more beach now. Maybe we can even take down those temporary barriers we put up. No. Those aren't the forces that we need to be concerned about. But, part of having everybody in the city sit through something like this, which is never going to happen. It just feels like, oh my goodness. So you're the experts on putting this, and you did. This is one of the finest pieces of facilitation I've seen, Zach, collecting all that data and putting it together so succinctly as you did. But it begs, what do you want us to do with it?
I'll just throw 2 more cents in. I think you really are probably looking at a serious community education program to,
Yeah.
you're not gonna be able to educate everybody, but you've got to get enough people up to speed so that you generate a
agree.
a near consensus on what are we trying to do here and where are we headed and what's our long-term vision. And so figure out how to carry forward all the good work that Zach and Matt have done for you and keep working with it.
So do we consider looking at this material and recognizing the revetments are in, the armoring is done, and begin looking at it from the perspective of 50 years out, or let's shorten it up, let's say 25 years out, when most of the people who are on the shoreline will be gone. They will have sold their property and they will have passed. Do we begin looking at it and saying, effective on this date and going forward, or today going forward, we are going to begin to create setbacks for the future. Your armoring's in, you're safe. Your property's safe, we're not going to take it away from you. But in the future, this is what the rules are going to be. If anyone expects to build on any of these parcels in the township or in the city or whatever the jurisdiction is, and address it that way to say, you're right, the revetments are going to fail, they're going to fall down. And so at least we would have taken a step into the future to say, our setbacks going forward are going to be this. So if your revetment fails, just recognize that we've created a whole new set of rules for you to deal with here. I'm just thinking, I want to do something, I'm sorry, I want to do something with this material other than just put it on a shelf and forget about it. So
I'm with you, Mark. See, I think there's other arenas this touches on too. I mean, it's just not, I really do think, and this isn't going to happen in the blink of an eye, but I think when people return for the tourist season here to South Haven, they go to South Beach, they're going to be pretty damn surprised they can't take a walk down to the power plant. I mean, I think tourism's going to take a hit in South Haven when they realize that South Beach has shrunk. And Lord knows if the wave energy keeps up, it's going to shrink more. So it has implications not only for the property owners, but it does have economic impact on our tourism when we have. I mean, the drone shots of the shoreline almost bring tears to my eyes. It's damn ugly.
I think, Mark, what you described is just about exactly what you need to be doing. So much of this revolves around the expectations people have about what it means to own shorefront property and what it means to be in a coastal community and what it means to have a natural beach. And we've done a whole lot of things. The lakes came up so fast. I think they took so many people by surprise, and a whole lot of armoring went in that probably should not have gone in. But that's what we have now. But we also know it's not going to last forever because the lake is going to keep doing everything it can to take it out. So start planning for that. Start getting people to recognize the trade-offs that have been made and to talk through the trade-offs they want to make in the future. And to kind of get expectations in alignment and start planning for the failure of those structures and how you're going to deal with that and what you might do in the meantime in terms of maybe nourishing beaches and allocating costs that way. Having those kinds of conversations is probably your next step.
Yeah, thank you.
And doing what you can to spread this information locally. Dick's spot on, and I tried to reference it earlier. There's a big attitude adjustment that we're facing on the shoreline with the amount of development. Every time, what I've learned from Dick and the other researchers, Guy and their teams, every time we have these high water periods, we learn some lessons. We see a bunch of new hardening, And then when the lakes go back down, and especially when they stayed down that period that Zach described, a good, more than a decade, a good 14, 15 years, it's just short-term memory. We all sort of
Absolutely.
forget, and we get used to different conditions. If this high water persists, we'll get kind of used to high water stuff, and we'll forget about where everybody was a few years ago, worried about dredging and access to marinas and all the trouble that came with low water. So, but starting at any time is a good time to start, because
Absolutely.
if you don't start now and the water goes down, and the next time the water comes up, you're right back where you are right now today in 2021, in terms of kind of knee-jerk reactions to processes that the science can demonstrate. We know it cycles. We know these cycles happen. We're not necessarily to the point yet where we're predicting exactly. We know that 2025 is going to be a high water year or a low water year. We don't have that sort of insight yet, but we know some basics. And Zach's chapter gives you all those basics. It arms you with the knowledge of those general trends, and we all know they're going to go up and down, et cetera. So, and they're sticky, wicked problems. They're not easy short-term fixes to any of this stuff. So the sooner the community starts to wrap its head around those basic facts and starts to adjust its attitudes of what it means to have property and infrastructure on the shoreline, the better off you'll be, even if it's incremental, even if it takes a long time to do it. I really think that the more that people understand about the processes and the difficulties that are created by developing too near the natural shoreline, I think the less popular it will become. People will just understand that, there's a lot of things we've learned in urban planning. It's genesis. The genesis of the field was in public health, when we weren't doing a good job of separating our waste from our populations and things like that, right? So that was a response to trying to make a place better, big problems that we created by developing and living together in communities. And I think the shoreline attitudinal adjustment it's not something that'll happen in a couple of years. So in conjunction with that education and knowledge, conjunction with you adjusting policies and understanding that the lakes are going to keep changing, no matter what we build or don't build, that those incremental steps are really critical. And there's lots of little baby steps that you can take over time that are going to make the next extreme a lot more weatherable for your community. And that'd be
Yeah, we're really looking at a huge change management project here, because human behavior is such that humans aren't very motivated towards moving towards the positive. They're motivated by avoiding harm. I mean, most of my friends never started exercise until they had their first stint from smoking. Then all of a sudden, I get it. So the issue here is we've been so much reacting to avoiding that short-term harm that people feel, that it's going to take a hell of a project, hell of an effort to move people towards a desired future. So I think, this is great work to help us do it, but boy, oh boy, oh boy.
Griffin, did you have a question?
I do. And, given the long-term challenges and decisions that we have to make that Mike and Mark have really been asking about, what have you all seen in terms of short-term next steps from some of the other communities you've worked with and presented research like this to?
A mixed array. We've had communities who have said we can't relocate, and we're not going to tell property owners that they can't put revetments in to save their property, and that's that. We had Chickaming Township, which Matt mentioned, who banned revetments outright. Dick, you've been working with
it really has been a mix. So some communities have just it's too late. It's all done. We're not going to do anything. Chickaming Township is the one that's gone so far the other way, and now they have the benefit. They have very little armoring on their shoreline right now, so they were looking at it and looking at what all of the neighbors have done, and that gave them the motivation and the ability to say, we're going to step out in front of it. So they're kind of at the other extreme. They're really doing everything they can to prevent armoring from going in, and they're now struggling with the little bit of armoring that's there. Other communities have been somewhere in the middle. They've adopted setbacks, kind of doing what Mark was heading, Mark, maybe it was you, Mike, that, create setbacks and try and start changing people's expectations about what they're going to be able to do if water levels rise. Probably the best example of that is Grand Haven. On our North Shore, they adopted a setback, which was not armored, but they created conditions to make it clear to folks, we're not going to let you put in hard armoring. They did allow geotubes as a variance approach. And they're hoping, they're kind of betting that the lakes are going to go back down and they'll be able to open those tubes up. So, but we haven't worked with a community like you that has virtually armored the entire shoreline and now is facing the difficult questions that you're facing. What do we do now? And so you're going to be at the front end. If you start to take meaningful steps to address that, you're going to be the case study everybody's going to look at to say, okay, what did they do? How did they deal with that? So congratulations.
Were these communities kind of, again, given the gamut of decisions that they've made, did you see the active public engagement efforts that you all were speaking about before those decisions were made to help not only include the community in those decisions, but really start to justify why they're being made ahead of time? Or did you see the alternative where the decision was made and then they had to start educating the community on, we made this decision, this is why we did it?
Yeah, the South Haven or St. Joseph efforts were prompted by the house that we use in a lot of our presentations that got built out way too close to the water. And the neighbors recognized immediately, oh my gosh, that could be the start of a really bad progression of things happening. And so it was that event that kind of tripped the public awareness of what was going on. And then John Hodgson is now the city manager there, and he's a really knowledgeable, thoughtful guy. And so they engaged a lot of community engagement. They used Leah, actually worked with Leah to do a lot of community engagement activity, and so got the public involved. The other communities either reached out to us and asked us to do presentations, or they participated with us in this larger research program, and every one of them involved a lot of extensive public engagement. And the only way they were able to do things like adopt setbacks was because they did that kind of public engagement and education, so that by the time the proposals got put on the table, people were understood the need for them and recognized them. Now, having said that, we also worked with Grand Haven Township, and we did the same kind of outreach and education, and they couldn't, when it came time to think about adopting a setback through a zoning ordinance, they couldn't get over the political hurdle. So having public engagement is not a guarantee that you're going to be able to make progress. So it's kind of a necessary but not sufficient thing. You need to do it. You need to engage it as much as you can. You need to get people involved, but you're still it's not a guarantee that you'll be able to take meaningful steps. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Joe?
I agree that every community should start looking now at long-term solutions and educating the public and having to make at some point some hard decisions to protect the towns and the shorelines. I get it completely. We also should look at short-term solutions. And my question is this: one of the short-term solutions is nourishment. I go to Florida a lot, and I see them doing it with giant trucks bringing sand in every year. They pour it down and they try their best to save the shorelines. And unlike us, they don't have the high for 10-year and low for 10-year. They have high and higher yet. And eventually the towns are going to be flooded, and there's no stopping it if you listen to the environmentalists. So here we could have 5 to 10 years with lower water. Would it behoove us to put nourishment in on the south side, which is a side that's hurt, so you can walk from the pier maybe for 100 yards or 150 yards and let the sand provide extra space for tourists to come in. The city will reap all those benefits. The stores will reap the benefits. And then we just look at a cost versus income and see if it makes sense. But it probably would make sense to do nourishment. So that's my first question. Does it make sense? And then my second question is, if we did nourishment, no one has ever told me where that sand goes. When it goes away, does it just go south further? Does it that go south further? And does somebody eventually benefit? Or does it go out in the middle of the lake and raise the water even more? Because something is happening to that volume if you raise the sand up.
Yeah, can I take a shot at that, Matt, or Zach? And nourishment might actually be a functional response on the Great Lakes in a way that they're not in Miami. You're right. They're pumping tons of sand on the beach in Florida, and it's just going to go away because the sea levels are rising. We have periods of rising lake levels and then periods of dropping lake levels. And so that might be a feasible option. You might want to reach out to the Army Corps and maybe talk to John Hodgson in the city of St. Joseph, because they worked out a deal with, I don't know if the Corps dredges your channels. Did they do that periodically? St. Joseph benefits from the dredging that goes on there because they just put the sand on the South Shore beach. They put the sand that's clean and usable on the South Shore beach. Not all of the material they dredge is usable as beach supply. And last summer, they negotiated with the Corps to basically do a little bit more dredging, I believe, to do a little bit more renourishment on their South Shore beach in the process of the dredging they were already scheduled to do for navigational purposes. So it might be worth, that would probably be a good call for you to talk to whoever your Corps engineer is. I don't know them, and maybe talk to John Hodgson and get his experience that way. That is certainly something to explore. I will tell you that, I talked to coastal engineers and I talked to the city of Bridgman, and they feel like it's throwing $100 bills on the beach because that sand could be lost in a storm. And you just don't know how long it's going to last. And then the second response is you're kind of both. That sand is going to move downshore in the predominant, if your predominant movement of sand is from north to south, it'll keep moving then north to south, or some of it may be carried out into the lake. It's not that much sand that it's going to really change water levels. I mean, it may seem like a whole lot of sand, but the lake is really big. It's not going to affect your water levels, but it could get carried far enough out into it's called the beyond the depth of closure, so that it's not part of the sand system anymore that's going to affect the beaches. It'll just go into the bottomlands. So the one final thing I'll say is the Eagle has not allowed communities to dredge from the bottomlands to renourish beaches. But that's mainly because nobody's done a study to find out if it's feasible and could be done without doing more harm than good. And so I mentioned to some communities, maybe you want to look into finding some engineers and ecologists to do the study to figure out if it's even feasible to take from the bottomlands. And that it would take that kind of a study to get Eagle to even think about it. But one of the problems we're going to run into is if you're renourishing the beach, where you're going to get your sand source. And their own, you can't sand mine too much up on the upland. So you're going to run into that as a potential limitation as well. So it's definitely an option worth exploring, but I wouldn't bank too much on it as a win-win kind of obvious thing to do.
8.
Yeah, just to kind of address something that Dr. Norton brought up. We were fortunate enough to get dredging in early 2020. That was after 10 years of asking for dredging from the federal government, which was kind of ironic due to the high water of that year. But as a small recreational harbor with no commercial activity, such as St. Joe has, or Muskegon or Holland, we just don't get the kind of dredging dollars that they do. We were fortunate enough to that the sand that they were dredging up was able to be placed on the South Beach. But as you said, it really only took one storm and they were gone. That sand was gone. So it is. We have looked at nourishment, but it's how much money do you want to put on the beach, and with really you can't be certain that it would stay there. Yeah, that's the tough thing right there.
Yeah.
Didn't we at one time during one of the sessions talk about, I don't use the correct words here, but it's almost like a perfect storm, because the revetment has awful changed the flow of the sand back out and move the sandbar further back into the lake, that we're actually losing that sand anyways? You know, it was almost like when we were talking about it before, I thought the point was we can put it on there, but you know what? It's sugar sand, and that stuff's that's gonna be beyond that sandbar, and it's lost again. Well, did I not
Yeah, Guy Meadows'
hear that?
research is starting to show that the sandbars are disappearing in front of the revetments, and it's looking like they're being pushed further and further offshore. And if they get out past that depth of closure, it won't come back
That's
into
what
the
I was thinking
system.
of.
And that's why they're concerned, especially when you've armored the whole shoreline, that eventually you're going to lose the beach, and it won't even come back during low lake level periods because it's so deep in front of that armoring structure. There's no sand
There's
left
no
in the
sand.
nearshore system. Yeah,
That's what I thought. It was.
that's what they're worried about.
Dr. Norton, are there examples of bottomland beach nourishment that you can think of?
That's why I say not on the Great Lakes, because Eagle has prohibited it. But what the Eagle staff has told me, they've mainly prohibited it because nobody's done a study to see if it's possible to do without doing more harm than good. And the state's not going to do it. They've got more than enough to spend money on and time to do it. So it's probably going to take someone who's interested in doing it to engage the right scientists to do that kind of study and see if it's feasible, and which it by itself is going to be a cost. So that may be beyond what you would consider, but
Has it
if you're
been,
thinking seriously about nourishment, that may be one thing to give some thought to.
has it been done anywhere in the United States or the world?
I don't honestly know the answer to that. I have heard that in the ocean coastal places, I've heard anecdotally that they've basically mined away all of their nearshore sand, and they're having to go further and further to get more sand because all of the sand they're putting on their beaches is being carried back out and lost, and they're only experiencing sea level rise. They don't have periodic drops.
So beach nourishment seems to be at best a temporary solution unless you've got an ongoing, you constantly continue to do it. I mean, it's not a one and done thing the way it sounds.
No, if you go down that route, you have to recognize you're going to be investing constant. It's armoring structures and nourishment are constant costs, periodic maintenance costs in one way or another over time.
Thanks, everyone. Any final questions before we wrap up here? All right, well, it's been a pleasure working with all of you, and Kate, I'll get those final documents to you, this master plan chapter, along with the the assessments of your master plan and your zoning ordinances. And thanks everyone for attending. Those of you who attended all three, thank you very much. It's been great. With that, I think I'll end it from here. And if you have any other questions, feel free to email Matt or myself or Dick. And I guess we've also volunteered Guy. So
yeah, he signed up too. Whether he likes it or not, we've signed him up. I best wishes to you all and your efforts.
Thanks, Zach. Take care.
Zach, I'm sure I'll speak for everybody, but thank you so much. It was really some fine work, really necessary work, and we really do appreciate it. So thank you much.
Very informative.
all right.
Amen.
Everyone, pleasure.